Don't worry about this slide. That's my day job. That's the last you'll see of it. I didn't put it on till the last minute in case everybody ran out when they saw it. So who am I? Well, if you get into blogging, it's a curious business. You get all sorts of names. After a Channel 4 News interview, somebody on the web likened me to this computer game thug. I wasn't too keen on that. I can't remember his name, thank God. Then, when the BMJ did an article about bloggers labelled rather disgustingly Silver Surfer, the picture frightened the child of a fellow blogger who thought I was a velociraptor. However, a comment came up on my website I was much more fond of. They said I'm the big friendly giant. So that's me. Now, what I want to talk about is essentially a betrayal of the Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment was a beautiful thing. People cast aside dogma and authority. They started to think for themselves. Natural science flourished. Understanding of the real world increased. The hegemony of religion slowly declined. Real universities were created. And eventually, democracy took hold. The modern world was born. Until recently, we were doing pretty well. What went wrong? Let's talk about universities a moment. At the beginning of the 19th century, universities evolved into institutions that valued freedom of thought and speech. The foundation of the Humboldt University in Berlin in 1810, sorry, and UCL in 1826, ended the iron grip of clerics and opened the way to teach science, engineering, and medicine. They became, at best, places where research could be conducted without restrictions and where people could speak their mind freely without the restraints and distortions imposed by politicians and commerce. That ability to criticize freely remains, in my view, one of the most vital roles of a university in a free society. But that ideal, I think, is endangered as never before in the last 100 years. In the United Kingdom, the Blair-Brown government appears to value education only insofar as it generates income and business. In the USA, since the passing of the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980, that resulted in large chunks of some departments essentially being owned by a single private corporation, which was enabled to exploit exclusively research done with public money. And they could dictate what was done, they could dictate secrecy between colleagues, and still worse, they could suppress the publication of results that were not favorable to the company. This is not good. A term I got increasingly fond of is endarkenment as an antonym to enlightenment. It was coined as, well, I don't know where it started, but I first came across it in an article by an American, Gerald Weissman, who was talking about evolution, which of course is a much bigger problem in the USA than it is here. When I say things in some respects, not all respects, but in some respects are getting worse, just compare the rows there are about creationism in the USA now with what Woodrow Wilson said in 1922. It was inconceivable to him that people wouldn't believe in evolution. And as for the founders of the Enlightenment in the USA, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, God knows what they would be thinking if they could see it now. So, some aspects of the endarkenment which affect universities are these. Francis Wheen wrote a lovely book called How Mumbo Jumbo Conquered the World, and he had 10 delusions, some of which don't concern us now, but the top is 4 of them. And the actual practical consequences of these sorts of delusions, things like the creation of divisive faith schools, young earth creationists running schools in the UK with the full support of Tony Blair, and indeed subsequently too. In the universities, ideas, to my mind, no more sensible, relativism, postmodernism, dressed up the same simplistic views that you could believe several things at the same time that are mutually incompatible, except they put it in much more pretentious language. Astrology and homeopathy you find everywhere, and including universities. Perhaps I'm stretching it a little bit, but I would include it, as in Darkenman thought, a sort of obscurantism. I think the German might be obscurantismus, I think, for this sort of thing. The belief that using long, complicated words, what's come to be known as management speak, actually means anything other than disguising lack of thought. I'll take as an example snake oil salesmanship, not because it's the most important example. It is the one I know most about, and it is a pretty offensive one, certainly when it comes to universities. Homeopathy was a form of medicine invented about 1810 by a German chap. In 1810, of course, modern medicine didn't exist. In fact, conventional medicine was pretty barbaric. But even by the standards of the time, homeopathy was completely balmy. It claimed that you could cure diseases with pills which contained no medicine, and furthermore, the less you gave, the bigger the effect. Well, that was obviously balmy even at the time, and even to a bishop, not the people I'd by temperament greatly favour. This lovely ditty was from 1832, not long after it was invented. A great opponent was Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote an essay in 1842 called Homeopathy and Its Kindred Delusions. That's Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was actually the physician father of the Supreme Court judge, who, like all good lawyers, has a large moustache. You can find more stuff about this in a couple of books that I can thoroughly recommend. Recent reading. This is about an American. It's about supplement hucksters. Supplement, by the way, is a term used for a drug when you wish to evade all the regulations that govern drugs. And the law is so full of loopholes, you could use it as a sieve, because it allows anything almost to be sold without a penalty. Okay, let's take a test. Here's 2 exam questions. Give you a moment to read and inwardly digest them. They look pretty archaic, I think you would agree. And indeed, the first one is archaic. It was set by Sidney Ringer in the Materia Medica and Therapeutics exam right here in 1863. The second one, what about the second one? Well, it mentions miasma, so perhaps this was also in the mid-19th century, at a time when cholera was thought to be spread by miasms, even evil-smelling vapors, before the science got to work and discovered what really caused cholera, in the form of the Broad Street pump, and later Robert Koch, the isolation of the organism. But no, it is not. That does not date from the mid-19th century. It dates from 2005, and it was an exam set by our close neighbour, the University of Westminster, in their homeopathic Materia Medica exam. I mean, can you believe it? There are actually 16 different universities that run 60 courses in the UK. All sorts of things, the so-called reflexology, which maintains that your big toe is connected to your kidney, though you can't actually see it, but people just have faith. These people are employed in the health service, many of them, amazingly. It's rife. It's very sad, though, that every one of these 16 universities is a post-1992 university. They do themselves, I think, a great deal of harm by doing that, but one hasn't been able to persuade them of that yet. People get a bit cross about that. Nature recently did quite a big issue on it with articles by their journalists, and I had a bit in it as well. This was their headline, actually. I don't think it's non-science, I think it's anti-science. It's actually a bit more serious than being non-science, because once you start believing things like that, then you can believe anything. It's a cultural poison. Homeopathic pills don't contain anything. The medicine contains no medicine. Anyone can understand that. But culturally, they're poisonous. How is it that they get into universities then? Who's responsible for this? Well, you might well think it would be the Quality Assurance Agency. The Quality Assurance Agency says, we safeguard and help to improve the academic standards and quality of higher education in the UK. Good. So, but they give full marks to these courses, some of them. So is it improving academic standards to give full marks to a course that teaches the smaller the dose, the bigger the effect? Seems very odd. The problem is, of course, that the QAA is not allowed to take into account what is taught. This is the ultimate absurdity of the QAA. I always thought so. And when they visited us, I said so, which probably accounts for why we didn't do too well. Well, I did warn them to keep me awake, but they wouldn't. So QAA costs £11.5 million a year, and it does a terrible job. It's not their fault, in fairness. We had an interchange with their CEO, remarkably amicable in the circumstances, in which he pointed out, and he's quite right, of course, that you wouldn't want a quango telling us what we teach in our courses. I said, you wouldn't want it. Nobody would. So their hands are tied, and that makes them, in my view, superfluous. The only person the responsibility can lie with, then, is the Vice-Chancellors of the university who do these things. If you go to Universities UK site, you'll find nothing mentioned. Well, if you hunt a bit, you can find one of their publications, Partners in Care, in which the former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Manchester says, however, more doctors and nurses are recognising that these treatments can and do work. I don't know which nurses and doctors he's been talking to. What actually doctors are doing at the moment is shutting down the Royal London Homeopathic and the Tunbridge Wells Homeopathic hospitals. So I think his source of information must have been not anyone I know. So I took it up with the president of UUK, Rick Craner from King's. He said they've all been independently assessed for academic rigour. Oh, come on. Of course, the people who write the assessments are other homeopaths. Of course, it's an entirely circular process. No, he's a social historian, not a scientist. But you really don't have to be a scientist to understand that it's preposterous to think that the smaller the dose you give, the bigger the effect. And if you want a really big effect, you give nothing at all. You just don't have to be a scientist, do you? The problem is that this arose... Yeah, that's the big push-off. I've had them before. The problem is that this arose because the Taxpayers Alliance wrote a report saying there are 400 non-courses in British universities that are wasting money. And it had all the usual suspects, golf course management, homeopathy, outdoor adventure with philosophy, and so on. Well, no, I don't mind golf course management. I'm not one of these people who says that's impossible. A golf course management degree may not be intellectual, but no one's going to mistake it for anything but what it is. It's absolutely honest. And if you want to call it a degree, well, what the hell? It's a bit different from before. It doesn't really matter. It's what it says on the label. Homeopathy is not what it says on the label. Literally, actually, if you get a bottle labeled Arnica 30C, it contains no arnica. And guess what? The Office of Fair Trading can't do anything about it because there's an exception in the law for them. So I tried to explain at length the difference between honest and dishonest degrees, but it was water off a duck's back. You can see I had the big push off. Now this is very odd because the next bit shows just the very end of an interview which was on Radio London News following that Nature piece, which had me up against Peter Fisher. Peter Fisher, I should say, is the sort of grand panjandrum of English homeopathy. He's clinical director of the Royal London Homeopathic Hospital. He's the Queen's homeopathic physician. He's also medically qualified, and as homeopaths go, I think a very honest man, if from my point of view deluded.
Dr. Fisher, could you ever see it as a science degree in future? I would hope so. I think I wouldn't deny that a lot of scientific research needs to be done, and I would hope that in the future it would have a scientific basis. I have to say that at the moment that basis isn't comprehensive, and to that extent I would agree as a group.
Oh, I do love that one. The one occasion on which Peter Fisher and I have ever agreed, almost the only, well, not quite the only occasion, as a matter of fact. So we have this ludicrous situation where I maintain that homeopathy degrees in dishonest shouldn't be in universities. Peter Fisher agrees they shouldn't be in universities because there isn't a scientific basis, but the collective of vice-chancellors, you can't get a word out of them. I mean, it just beggars belief. The 16 universities in question, and the Times Higher Ed Sup did a piece on this, they wrote to all 16 vice-chancellors to ask for their views, their justification for these things, or just their opinions. They got 4 replies. The rest, the other letters were simply ignored, as mine are universally. It will not do for vice-chancellors who have paid quite a lot of money out of the public purse to simply refuse to answer perfectly courteous questions from people who have a legitimate interest in it. But that's what happens, by and large. If you do get a reply, I have managed to, they use 2 justifications. One is that, well, these students do a lot of regular science as well, and the other is that they've been independently assessed. Well, they do physiology in some of the courses, that's right. That means on their physiology lectures on Mondays and Wednesdays, they're told that the bigger the dose you give, the bigger the response. On their homeopathy lectures on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they're told precisely the opposite. And, this is just no way to run a university. Independent assessment. Well, since the assessors is done of courses in magic is done by people who believe in magic, of course, they approve of them. They're also a pretty good example of management speak. The University of Central Lancashire, one of the few things I managed to get out of them was their 49-page justification for their degree in homeopathy. It's full of all the right words, summative and normative assessment, logbooks, schedules, but not one single word about the fact that what they were teaching was a load of old early 19th century garbage. Not a single word about truth and falsehood. That truth and falsehood is a concept which has gone right out in universities, in some sections of them. It's a sort of box-ticking culture. It's like the QA. They tick the boxes and they think that it's all right. And that sort of box-ticking culture is pretty rife in universities and not least in HR departments. Take laying on of hands. You might think this is a fairly bizarre form of practice, but I learned from the Islington Tribune, somebody sent it to me again, that UCLH applies layers on of hands or spiritual healers. There's actually empirical evidence it doesn't prolong your life at all. It may make you feel a bit happier. Well, keep them away from me if I'm down from cancer, but some people might like it. But there's an honest way to have placebo effect. You don't have to do it in this sort of mystical way. But that doesn't matter a damn to folks in HR. All that matters is you can tick the box. Here's a person specification. As long as you can tick the box to say you've a full National Federation of Spiritual Healer certificate with 2 years post-certificate experience, that's okay. You're on. It's the unthinking box-ticking mentality which rather plagues us at the moment. I return to my original theme. It's very important, never been more important, that universities have to be places for independent thought and impartial expertise. The awful thing is that scientists are now really quite widely distrusted by the public. One is, I realized this when first, in its most serious form, listening to the Today program a few years ago, the interviewer asked a scientist, he said, Dr. X, this is the 5th breakthrough in cancer this month. Now, tell me, is this really a breakthrough, or are you applying for a grant, or are you up for promotion, or are you perhaps floating a startup company? I thought, my God, this is This is not a private university game. This is the reaction you get when you try to talk about science on the radio. There's something really quite seriously wrong. I think it results partly from the sort of exaggeration that results from the intense over-competitiveness that now exists, certainly in biomedical sciences. It's partly competition for funds, but to a large extent it's meeting artificial targets. Have you published the right number of papers, and so on. This question of metrics for assessment of people, the ACE box-ticking exercise, is really going to be serious, because the next RIE is threatened to be done that way. It doesn't actually require that, or doesn't require a financial interest. Scientists, to a large extent, deserve their reputation for not being trustworthy, because they continually exaggerate the significance of their findings, just to ensure promotion, perhaps, and so on. It's vanity, I suppose, at the end. And then they get overhyped again by the media department, who put out quite frequently pretty irresponsible press releases. The corporatization of universities, in the sense of both internal corporatization, introducing corporate structures, and also external funding from industry, have also contributed to the atmosphere in which scientists are no longer considered entirely trustworthy. Ghost authorship is rife. People getting names on their papers for little or no contribution to the work is all over the place, at least in my field. I learned some time ago that when you interview people for a job and you ask them to name their 4 best papers, you better ask them about those papers in detail, the methods section. 9 times out of, quite often, I have no numbers, quite often, you elicit after much questioning that they only did figure 7 and they haven't read the rest of it. Or indeed, sometimes they hadn't actually read the paper at all in extreme cases. That does occasionally happen. In clinical work especially, the situation has arisen where papers are not actually written by the first author at all, whose name was hired for a fee, and it's written by a company ghostwriter. There have been several cases of that. The ones that are known about are mostly in the States. Well, I don't know whether that's because they're worse or because they're better at finding this sort of stuff out. But whatever it is, the public have noticed. After the Korean cloning scandal, this spoof paper appeared, extension of human lifespan to 969 years by inserting some genes from a bristlecone pine. It was just a spoof, but it wasn't in a scientific journal. It was in the New York Times. This is an indication of the perception of science that has arisen from some of the considerations I'm talking about. Because of this ripeness of guest authorship, many journals now, or some journals at least, require the authors to indicate what their contribution was. The first author, you see, was fairly honest, given that we had only extended the lifespan of fruit flies by 3%. I did wonder about the title, but my boss told me I had to go along with it. It's what it amounts to. It happens. Here's a couple of good books, which are not concerned with quackery, but with regular science. Both predominantly American, unfortunately. Again, I'm not sure whether that's because it's worse there or because they're just more assiduous in uncovering things. Marcia Angle is not a rabble-rousing journalist. She was an ex-editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most revered medical journals, now working in Harvard. The other lady is a medical journalist, and there are some fairly hair-raising tales in that book too. Now, what I want to finish with is a bit of a word about metrics. How you assess people, how you assess good work. Everybody in this university and every other one wants the place to flourish. They want to get good scientists who win, maybe even Nobel Prizes. I mean, really win Nobel Prizes, not just be claimed to have done because they won't set foot on the grass in the quad. If you look at the list of 20 UCL Nobel Prize winners, you'll see that several of them are in that category. And this is just hyper again. Again, as a consequence of blogging, people do send you very interesting things. I had a bunch of stuff from Imperial Medical School. I discovered how they assess their staff. This was a fairly senior ex-Royal Society research fellow, clinical scientist. This is not public knowledge. This was not to be found anywhere on their website. So they're probably rather cross when I published the lot in the Times Higher Ed supplement. I mean, hard luck, you shouldn't do it if you don't want it published. He was assessed by largely his grant income and his publication score. The publication score is calculated by multiplying the impact factor of the journal. That's a measure of how many times the journal gets cited, and therefore of interest to nobody but journal editors. You multiply it by the author position weight and divide by the number of authors. And you get 5 points for being the first or last author, despite the fact that frequently the last author has done bugger all. Not always, but quite frequently. 3 for the second, second for the third, and 1 for any other position in the author list. This is completely mad. It's very easy to show that it's completely mad. Just apply it to somebody you respect in your own field and look at the ludicrous things that come out. One of the best-known things about impact factors are invented by a chap called Eugene Garfield, who's caused endless harm to academia by so doing, but even he has said quite clearly they're not suitable for assessing individuals' worth. For a start, they're not. If you look at individual papers, there's no detectable correlation between impact factors and the number of citations that a paper gets. The left-hand graph there shows the relation, or rather lack of it, between citations plotted against impact factor. This happened to be 22 papers of mine, but it's been shown to be quite generally true in several interesting papers. This is the relation between number of citations and Imperial's publication score. It's like negative correlation in that case, not nothing significant, of course. So impact factors are obviously useful. Actually, citation rates are useless too. I just checked a couple before this morning. I had a letter in Nature, all the same journal, just to make it easy. I had a letter in Nature in 1975, which was completely wrong. You got 110 citations, sort of moderate for these things. We did it much better once single-channel methods became available, corrected it, and the corrected one got half as many citations, 61. You're going to judge the worth of those papers on the number of citations, you get completely the wrong answer. Well, I highly cited things, actually. It's an utterly trivial paper that arose from a vacation job in Bern. It's a fun job. We observed a sort of channel in the early days of this business, which was in a quite trivial way from earlier ones. So at that time, anything with a single channel in it sailed into Nature. That's the nature of the journal. Sorry, no pun intended. And that got 631 citations. Utterly trivial. No decent analysis. I measured up on the floor with a ruler, actually, to then cruise it away. Complete crap. It's my most highly cited paper. This is absurd. It's very disappointing, then, to find that if you look up UCL's current promotion form, it says candidates may wish to provide impact factors, citation rates, or other bibliographic information. Such information will simply mislead. What people have to do is to find out if the papers are any damn good. And there's no easy way to do that. You've got to read the things, or somebody who knows about them has to read them. There is no substitute. And once we're assessed automatically by these numbers, the effect on the conduct of science, I think, could be very bad indeed. This is what I mean by applying it to someone you respect. Bert Sackman, a German scientist, jointly got the Nobel Prize in 1991 for discovering how to record from single channels. He and they are people enormously respected in their field. If you look at him in the 10 years when he was coming to fame, from 1976 to 1985, you find that he failed Imperial's productivity criterion in 6 of those 10 years. In 2 of them, he had no publications at all. And 6 years after the end of that 10-year period, he had a Nobel Prize. Applying criteria like Imperial are doing is a guarantee of firing the best people, the people who are going to get Nobel Prizes or even FRSs for what they're worth. And, you know, I should worry if Imperial's doing that, it's their problem. But I would very much worry if UCL was doing it. And I fear we're heading in a more corporate direction that could, unless we're very careful and you guys speak up when it's necessary, lead to that sort of a situation. The fact is, universities are going to have to decide what sort of science they want. If they bend to every whim of the RAE and to the pressures from HESI to get corporate structures and to the government to automate in some phony way the measurement of people's performance, they will go downhill. If they certainly can't have that and creative science. And if they want creative science, they will have to have universities that are run by academics. They will have to avoid corporate and commercial pressures. They'll have to resist the pressures to remove power from their best researchers. They'll have to resist the pressure to abolish eminent departments with worldwide reputations, such as pharmacology, for example. And they'll have to take notice of information. I'm going to leave you with the words of Ted Ragg, whom I just love. Pity he's dead. He could sum it up beautifully. I'll give you 30 seconds to read it. It's too much to read out, but it is just lovely. The motto of this lecture is, who needs a physics teacher when among today's most highly esteemed pedagogues are wordsmiths who can deliver world-class meaningless bollocks to order. And the last quotation is on the handout, but I want to go into who wrote that. Okay, thank you very much. I even left 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David, for that sort of illuminating talk about the Emperor coming and close. I should have said when I introduced Professor Cahoon that he is himself a fellow of the Royal Society, that he is, needless to say, a world-famous scientist, and therefore, because I would have loved to introduce him in terms of his own extraordinary scientific achievements, but if you want to read more about how he can not just make politics, but science make simple, you may want to read long interview with him on his web pages, where he's called, quite rightly, one of Britain's leading scientists. He's called very British. Do you know that?
Where is that?
In the interview. But,
oh, yeah, another one, yes. American, by an American, though.
By an American, yeah. Who's full admiration for his scientific work on the whole, but also for his ability to speak out on some extremely important issues. And we have about 5 minutes. As it were, of discussion. So if you want to have any questions for Professor Cahoon, please let's have them now. But we have to be yours by 5 too.
What does your own Vice-Chancellor say? Have you been in contact with him?
Yes, we've had quite frequent contact, but he hasn't heard this lecture unless he's watching on the live video. I don't think he's here. So I don't know what he says about these things. Says he diplomatically.
Some of the correspondence is on your webpage, I believe.
Not to the Vice-Chancellor, I don't think.
I thought I'd seen some, but... let's have to move to slightly...
I won't be that discreet. I think some of the things that are going on are not going to help this place. I do think that this is a movement which is gradually running out of steam, however. I'm optimistic about the future. UCL will last any short-term measures.
Sorry,
I think the future has written quite a lot about this afternoon. What is the action paragraph? What are you going to do?
Well, what I do is blog, actually. It sounds silly, but the world has really changed. In 18 months, a dozen fairly elderly academics writing letters and another dozen or so largely young, but not entirely young bloggers have actually shut down 2 homeopathic hospitals. I mean, we don't take the sole credit, but most of it, I think. You can actually do things this way. I mean, my website gets about 1,000 or 2,000 hits a day now. Ben Goldacre's gets 15,000 hits a day. These guys are enormously read, far better than any book. You can actually do things that way. That's one way. The other way, of course, is you can go to academic board and you can stand up instead of sitting there in silence. It takes a little courage, but it doesn't take that much. You may get shot down. I've been shot down a few times. What the hell? They won't fire you. People are very frightened that they'll be harmed if they do this, and on the whole, they don't suffer, actually.
I suppose it helps to be retired or to be a research professor.
Well, it does help, yes. But, you know, the management doesn't control directly your promotion or your grants or anything that matters.
And there are many boards.
Unless you actually get kicked out, which has never happened to my consciousness, not for speaking out, there's very little they can do. But if you sit quiet, if you stay quiet, you'll for sure get trodden on. Simple as that. You've got to go to the board, you've got to say what you think.
Thanks.
Thanks very much for the talk. I was just quite intrigued by this concept of true science that you were mentioning. And I was thinking if, so just look at the brief history of science. When maybe Newton was around, there was all sorts of alchemy or similar to what the homeopathy is now going along. And when Darwin was writing, similarly, they still had the old concept of Aristotle's elements. And when Einstein was around, God knows what other rubbish science was in the area. So isn't it that to be able to produce true science, you have to be a scientist who can ignore all that is going on, have that confidence, and just carry on with what you think is right until
yes,
right.
All these people were children of their times. It takes time to grow out of these things. Newton revolutionized the world, but he also believed a bit in alchemy, yes. So, but that hadn't been disproved. No doubt, if he'd lived a little longer and it was shown to be rubbish, and the atomic theory, if he'd lived to see the atomic theory, he wouldn't have believed in it any longer, you can be sure, because he was a very bright man, put it mildly. I don't think it matters that these things are going on concurrently. You just have to look for evidence. You have to apply Enlightenment values, period.
Let's suppose that the government suddenly decides to listen to you.
That's a big supposition, yeah, go on.
And reconstitutes the QAA with a new unit to decide what should and what should not be taught at the universities. Where does that end?
I don't think they should do that. I think they should abolish the QAA. They certainly shouldn't dictate to universities. No, you have to have a sort of culture change. It's not going to be instant. What you've got to do is fire the vice-chancellors and get some decent ones. I don't say any other way. You certainly can't have it dictated by a government department what you teach. Absolutely not. The head of the QAA is dead right in that respect. No, it has to evolve. We have to do the best to discredit the sort of people who conduct their affairs, conduct the university's affairs in that way, and I'm doing my best to go ahead and do yours, I say.
One more question.
Thank you very much for your lecture and for your clarity. Why do you lump together homeopathy and spiritual healing?
Because neither have shown evidence of effectiveness. It's very simple. The point about the Enlightenment was that you took notice of evidence, not dogma. And there's no evidence for either of them having a beneficial effect. period.
Well, I can understand you attacking homeopathy, I think, spiritual healings and other matters.
Well, I disagree. I think they come into much the same category. Both can produce placebo effects, but both largely, one suspects, rely not even on a placebo effect, simply on the fact that people get better. Or if they're terminal cancer patients, of course, they don't get better, but neither do they live any longer when they're given spiritual healing.
I think we have to leave it there, I'm afraid.